His attorney's hands were shaking. Not a little, visibly, embarrassingly shaking, the kind of trembling you see in someone who just realized the ground beneath them isn't solid anymore. Elliot Marsh, the lawyer my husband had bragged about for weeks, the one who supposedly hadn't lost a case in 11 years, was standing at the plaintiff's table rifling through documents like a man searching for an exit that doesn't exist. My husband sat beside him, and I watched the moment he understood. The smirk he'd been wearing since he filed, that patient, satisfied smirk of a man who thinks he's already won, just dissolved. What replaced it was something I'd never seen on his face before. Fear. Real fear. This was the man who told me I'd walk away with nothing. The man who said I was lucky he was even letting me keep my car. The man who stood in our kitchen 6 weeks ago and told me, very calmly, that I had contributed nothing to this marriage and I should be grateful he wasn't taking me to court for wasting his best years. He finally understood what I had been doing while he was busy feeling superior. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning. Because 6 weeks ago, I was the one who thought her life was finished. My name is Sloane Mercer. I'm 31 years old. For 7 years, I believed I was building something real with my husband. Not a fairy tale. I'm not naive, but something solid. Something worth protecting. I had been a licensed insurance fraud investigator before we got married, the kind of job where you spend your days looking for the thing people are trying to hide. I was good at it. My supervisor used to joke that I had a sixth sense for dishonesty. Then my husband's career took off, and we moved from Phoenix to Seattle for his job, and he said it made more sense for one of us to be the anchor. He traveled constantly. Someone had to be home. I was the one who knew more people in Phoenix, who had the established client relationships, who would have had to start over anyway. So I started over, just not in the way I'd expected. I became the person who made everything run. I managed the house, the finances, the social calendar, the dinner parties that helped him land clients. I kept my investigator's license current because I told myself I'd go back eventually. I always told myself that. The night everything ended started with my husband coming home early from what he said was a business trip to Portland. That was the first strange thing. He never came home early from anything. He set his laptop back down on the kitchen counter, poured himself a drink without offering me one, and told me he wanted a divorce. Just like that. No preamble, no conversation, nothing. He had already spoken to an attorney. He had already, he said, structured things appropriately. I remember staring at him and thinking that the man I had married would never use the phrase structured things appropriately about the end of our marriage. This was someone else standing in my kitchen. I asked him what that meant, structured things appropriately, and he told me. He intended to keep the house. He intended to keep the investment accounts. He had moved money into a separate account months ago, he said, and that money was his business operating capital and not subject to division. I would receive a settlement he described as fair given my lack of income contribution. He said all of this like he was reading from a document, which, I later realized, he probably had been practicing. Then he said the thing I will never forget for the rest of my life. I asked him if he had thought about what this would do to our families, to the people who loved us, to the years we had given each other, and he looked at me with no expression at all and said that was exactly the problem. I was always too emotional, too focused on feelings, and that was why I'd never been able to hold a real career. He said he needed someone who matched his level. I didn't cry in front of him. I don't know how I managed that, but I didn't. I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at the room we had shared for 4 years, and I thought, he has been planning this. This didn't happen tonight. This happened months ago, maybe longer. He stayed at a hotel that night. I found that out when I went downstairs at 2 in the morning and realized he'd taken his garment bag from the closet before he left, which meant he had already packed, which meant he had not come home early from Portland. He had never gone to Portland. I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table until sunrise, going through what I actually knew about our finances and what I was realizing I had been kept from knowing. I managed our household accounts, the joint checking, the mortgage, the utilities. But my husband handled everything else. He handled the investment accounts, the business accounts, the taxes. He always said it was more efficient that way, given his financial background. I had trusted that. I had trusted him completely, the way you trust the floor to hold your weight, without ever stopping to question whether it's solid. When the sun came up, I called my older sister in Scottsdale. She's the practical one. She listened to everything I said without interrupting, which is rare for her. And then she said, "Sloane, before you do anything else, you need to find out what you're actually owed. And you need someone to help you figure that out before he does anything else to make it disappear." She was right. She is almost always right, which is deeply irritating. I called my friend Priya that same morning. Priya and I had worked together at the investigative firm years ago. She'd gone the forensic direction after getting her CPA, and now she ran her own practice in Bellevue, about 20 minutes from our house. When I explained the situation, she went quiet for a moment. Then she said she would be at my place by 7 that evening with her laptop and a bottle of wine, and that I should pull together every document I could legally access. What Priya found in the first 3 hours sitting at my dining room table made her put down her wine glass. The investment accounts showed regular, significant outflows going back 14 months. Not withdrawals, transfers. To an account she couldn't identify from the statements I had. The amounts were irregular enough to look like operating expenses, but consistent enough to suggest a pattern. She said the word pattern the way she used to say it at work when we'd find something that mattered. There was also the matter of his business revenue. I knew roughly what my husband made. He'd told me, in general terms, over the years. What Priya was looking at suggested his reported income was significantly lower than what the inflows to his business account indicated. The difference wasn't small. It was the kind of difference that requires a decision, not an oversight. A decision. I pulled out the folder where I kept copies of our tax returns. I had always insisted on keeping paper copies of everything, a habit from my investigator days that my husband used to tease me about. He called it paranoid. He said things like that. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive. Observations that made me feel slightly foolish for being careful. I was very grateful for that paranoia now. Priya looked at the tax returns and then she looked at me, and she said, "How much do you know about a company called Meridian Consulting Group?" I had never heard of it. She turned her laptop screen toward me. Meridian Consulting Group was a limited liability company registered in Wyoming, specifically because Wyoming has some of the most permissive LLC privacy laws in the country. It had been registered 2 years ago. The registered agent was a law firm. The documentation listed no named principals. But the address on file was a mailbox service 3 miles from our house. I sat with that for a moment. 2 years ago. He had been building this for at least 2 years. The thing about being trained to look for hidden information is that once you start looking, you can't stop. It's not a switch you flip, it's a mode you slip into. I hadn't used those skills in almost 5 years, but they came back the way muscle memory comes back. Automatic. Precise. I requested every financial document I was legally entitled to access through the divorce discovery process. I went through the records we had at home line by line. I tracked every transfer I could identify, and I started building a picture of where my husband's money had actually been going. Some of it was Meridian. He'd been routing consulting fees through it, real income that appeared in his business accounts, then transferred to Meridian, then effectively disappeared from anything that looked like a marital asset. It was clean enough to look like legitimate business expense if you weren't looking carefully. If you were looking carefully, it was textbook asset concealment. Some of it was something else. I found the receipts by accident, the way you sometimes find things you weren't quite ready to find. I was going through a folder of old insurance documents looking for a policy number when I found a hotel confirmation. The Heathman. Portland, Oregon. A suite, 2 nights, 8 months ago. I found 3 more after that same hotel, different dates. All on nights he had told me he was traveling for work. I thought about whether I wanted to know more. I decided I did. That's the thing about investigation training. It removes a certain kind of innocence, and once it's gone, you can't put it back, and you stop wanting to. I will not spend much time on what I found, because she is not the point of the story. She is younger, she works in his industry, and she has been in photographs on his company's social media that I had looked at without understanding what I was looking at. She is not the disease. She was the symptom of a marriage that had been ending quietly while I was home making sure everything ran smoothly. What I felt when I confirmed it was not what I expected. It wasn't devastation, it was something colder. Something that felt a great deal like clarity. Before I continue, if this story is speaking to something you've been through or something you've been afraid of, please subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single comment. Your presence here means more than I can say. Now let me tell you what I did next. I needed a lawyer who was not afraid of Elliot Marsh. My husband had retained Elliot Marsh of Marsh & Calloway within what I now understand was days of making his decision, which meant he had spent months preparing while I had nothing. Marsh had a reputation, not just in Seattle but regionally. He was the attorney that wealthy men hired when they wanted to make sure their wives left with as little as possible. He was very good at it. I asked Priya if she knew anyone. She made a call. Her name was Vivian Cole. She had been practicing family law for 19 years. She kept her office in a building that used to be a printing warehouse in Capitol Hill, and when I walked in and told her who my husband had hired, she smiled a very specific kind of smile, the kind that means she'd been waiting for an opportunity. She told me she had opposed Marsh twice. She had won once and lost once, and she had learned from the loss in a way she hadn't from the win. She said she would take my case on a hybrid fee arrangement because what I had brought her was not a difficult case. It was, she said, a very clear case that someone had worked hard to make look complicated. She gave me one instruction before we left the office: act like you've already given up. Be hesitant in communications. Seem overwhelmed by the process. Let Marsh think you're folding. The more comfortable he became, she said, the less careful he would be. And careless people made mistakes that ended up in the court record. So I did. When Marsh sent aggressive correspondence, I responded with requests for extensions. When my husband called to suggest I accept his initial offer, I let my voice go small and said I was still thinking about everything. He told me not to wait too long. He said he was trying to be reasonable, but his patience had limits. I thanked him for his patience. Then I went back to the dining room table and kept working. There was a woman named Odette who worked as my husband's office manager. She'd been with his company since nearly the beginning. I'd met her at firm events over the years, a quiet woman in her late 50s with careful eyes and a habit of noticing things. I hadn't thought much about her beyond the pleasantries of those events. I thought about her differently when she called me on a Thursday evening 6 days before the hearing. She asked if we could meet somewhere private. I said yes. We met at a coffee shop near her apartment in Greenwood. She ordered tea and held the cup without drinking it and told me she had been with the company for 9 years. She had processed payments. She had filed documents. She had watched things happen that she had told herself were not her business to question because she was an office manager and not an attorney. And she had a mortgage and a daughter in college, and she had needed the job to remain the job. She had watched my husband treat me at company events. She had seen the way he talked over me when I spoke, the way he redirected conversations away from anything I contributed. She said she had thought of it as just the way some men were, and she had told herself that wasn't something she could do anything about. But she had kept records, not intentionally, not as a plan. She had simply never deleted things, the way careful people sometimes don't. Emails she was copied on, transaction records she'd processed, internal memos that referenced the Meridian account by name. She had a folder on her home computer that she had never quite gotten around to deleting. She slid a thumb drive across the table. I looked at her and asked if she understood what would happen when this came out. She would likely lose her position. My husband would almost certainly try to make things difficult for her. She wrapped both hands around her teacup and said she was 58 years old and she had watched her sister go through a divorce 20 years ago where the husband hid everything and the court never found it, and her sister had spent a decade rebuilding from almost nothing. She said she was not willing to be part of the reason that happened to someone else. She said she had already been in touch with a contact at a firm her daughter recommended. She had an interview the following week. When Vivian saw what was on that drive, she went quiet for almost a full minute. Then she said, "We're not just winning the divorce." She was right. The documentation showed not only the Meridian transfers but a pattern of invoicing that amounted to fraud against two of my husband's minority business partners, men who had invested in the company in its early years and whose returns had been systematically suppressed while my husband's personal accounts grew. The partners had no idea. They thought the company was underperforming. It wasn't underperforming. It was being drained from the inside while they received reports that had been carefully altered. We prepared 4 copies of the complete evidence package, one for the divorce court, one that went through appropriate channels to the IRS, one to my husband's business partners delivered 2 days before the hearing, and one to a contact Vivian had at the state bar because some of the documentation suggested that someone had helped structure this in ways that raised professional conduct questions. The hearing was assigned to Judge Lorraine Abbott. I looked her up. She had been on the family court bench for 16 years. She was known for 3 things: efficiency, intolerance for evasion, and a particular impatience with financial gamesmanship in divorce cases. Of all the judges in King County, she was the one I would have chosen. My husband called me the night before the hearing. He sounded relaxed, almost cheerful the way he sounded before a deal closed. He said he hoped I had thought seriously about his settlement offer because it was going to be much easier for both of us if we resolved this without a protracted court process. He said he was willing to be generous if I was willing to be practical. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I told him I was planning to be there tomorrow regardless. He said that was fine, he'd see me there. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Wood paneling, low ceilings, the particular quiet of a room where difficult things happen regularly. I had dressed in grey, not to be invisible, but to be unremarkable. Vivian's instruction: don't give them anything to respond to. My husband arrived with Marsh and a junior associate, 3 of them. Marsh wore the kind of suit that announces itself. My husband was relaxed, smiling at his attorney, projecting the easy confidence of someone who believes the outcome is already settled. He glanced at me when he sat down and nodded, the way you nod at someone you've already decided isn't a threat. In the back of the gallery, I could see 2 men I recognized from a holiday party 4 years ago, my husband's business partners. They had received their packages. They had not told my husband they were coming. They sat very still. Marsh presented first. He was skilled. I'll give him that. He constructed a version of our marriage in which my husband was a hard-working provider and I was a pleasant but professionally inactive spouse who had made no meaningful financial contribution to our shared life. He noted my lack of income, my reliance on my husband's earnings, the fact that I had left a career voluntarily. He described the settlement offer as more than generous and urged the court to consider the equities accordingly. Then Vivian stood up. She began with the house. When we'd bought it 6 years ago, I had brought $140,000 to the down payment, money from an inheritance from my grandmother that I had saved and invested for 3 years before we married. I had the original wire transfer. I had the closing statement. I had a document in my own handwriting from the week we closed, noting the amount and the source, which I had sent to my sister in an email because I wanted someone outside the marriage to know. The title, however, showed only my husband's name. He had managed the closing. I had trusted him to handle it. Marsh objected. The judge looked at the documents. She asked my husband directly whether he disputed that the down payment funds had originated from my account. He said the source of funds was complicated. Judge Abbott said she found the wire transfer documentation fairly straightforward. Then came the investment accounts. Exhibit by exhibit, Vivienne walked through the transfers, the timing, the pattern, the gap between reported income and actual revenue, the meridian structure, the Wyoming registration, the mailbox address. My husband's expression did not change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted. Marsh leaned over and whispered something. My husband shook his head very slightly. The partners in the back of the gallery were very, very still. When Vivienne introduced the documentation relating to the business partner accounts, the altered returns, the suppressed distributions, Marsh asked for a recess. He said his client needed time to confer with counsel regarding certain documentation that had not been provided in discovery. Vivienne said she was happy to discuss how that documentation had been routed around standard discovery protections. Judge Abbott denied the recess. She said she had been on the bench long enough to recognize a financial disclosure problem when she saw one. She said she was going to continue, and she would be referring certain aspects of the financial record to the appropriate authorities, and she would expect complete transparency from this point forward in these proceedings. Marsh's hands, I noticed this from across the room, were not steady. My husband turned and saw his partners for the first time. One of them, the quieter one who had always been kind to me at those events, looked directly at my husband for a long moment and then looked away. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I will not pretend the rest of the hearing was enjoyable. Legal proceedings are exhausting and slow, and there were moments that were genuinely painful. But the outcome. The house came to me. Full title transfer. The court found that the down payment constituted a separate property contribution traceable to my premarital inheritance, and that the title misrepresentation had been intentional. 65% of all marital assets were awarded to me, adjusted for my husband's concealment of assets, perjury in his financial declarations, and the clear disparity in resources available to each party during the proceedings. Maintenance was awarded at a level calculated on my husband's actual income, not his reported income. Marsh withdrew from representation within 2 weeks, citing a scheduling conflict. The IRS opened an inquiry. The business partners filed a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud. My husband's assets were frozen pending investigation. The Portland hotel was no longer an option. Neither was anything else that required liquid funds. Odette started her new job the week after the hearing. She sent me a card, just a small card, the kind you find at a drugstore, that said she hoped things were going well. Inside, she had written, "My sister says thank you, even though she doesn't know it's you. Some things matter more than being comfortable." I keep that card in the drawer of my desk at the consulting firm where I went back to work 3 months after the hearing. I took the position because it had the strongest benefits package, and because the work is interesting, and because it turns out that 7 years away from investigative work doesn't erase what you know. It just waits for you. I live in the house now. I repainted the entryway a color I had always liked, and my husband had always vetoed. I got a dog, a medium-sized, not very obedient, extremely affectionate mutt named Oliver, who has claimed the left side of the couch as his permanent territory and shows no signs of relocating. Having a living thing in the house that was completely glad to see me every single day turned out to be more restorative than I would have predicted. I ran into my husband once at a gas station about a month ago. He was driving a car I didn't recognize, something modest, nothing like the car he'd had. He saw me. He started to say something. I don't know what he was going to say, and I found that I genuinely did not need to. I got in my car and I drove home. My grandmother used to tell me that the people who underestimate you are always, in the end, doing you a favor. I was not sure I believed that when she said it. I am more sure of it now. If you're watching this and you're somewhere in the middle of your own impossible situation, I want you to know something. The version of yourself that you had before someone told you that you weren't enough. She's still there. She's been waiting. She's a great deal more patient than the people who counted her out. Thank you so much for being here with me. If this story reached you, please like it and share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more stories waiting for you on this channel right now. Click one, and I'll see you there. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that courtroom, not the legal part, the human part. The moment my husband saw his business partner sitting in the back row and the color left his face, and he understood that the world he thought he'd controlled had already shifted underneath him. That moment didn't come from luck, it came from a very long chain of choices. His and mine both. He made choices for years. Small ones at first, probably. A transfer here, an account there. A document he didn't put my name on because it was more convenient not to. Each one must have felt manageable. Each one must have felt manageable. Each one must have felt like something he could explain if he ever had to. And then the choices got bigger, because they always do when nobody pushes back. When you take something small and nothing happens, you reach for something larger. That's not a mystery. That's just what happens when a person stops believing that their actions have weight. I made choices too. I chose to keep my license current during years when I had no professional reason to. I chose to keep paper copies of financial documents in a folder my husband thought was paranoid. I chose to call Priya the morning after everything fell apart instead of waiting to feel less devastated. None of those felt like strategy at the time. They felt like habits. The kind of habits that come from believing, even quietly, even in the back of your mind, that you are someone worth protecting. That's the part I keep coming back to. Odette kept those files for 9 years without a clear plan. She just never deleted them, because something in her understood they might matter someday. Vivian had lost a case against Marsh and spent years learning from it rather than writing it off. Priya looked at a bank statement on a Thursday night and immediately saw what was wrong because she had spent years building the skill to see it. None of us were operating on hope alone. We were operating on the accumulated weight of things we had quietly refused to let go of. I don't think what happened to my husband was punishment exactly, though I understand why it looks that way. I think it was consequence. There's a difference. Punishment is something imposed from outside. Consequence is what happens when the structure you built finally has to hold the weight of what it actually is. His structure looked solid for years. It looked like success, like confidence, like a man who had everything arranged exactly as he wanted. But it was built on falsified documents and other people's trust, and those are not load-bearing materials. Eventually, everything built on them comes down. What I want you to take from this, if you're in something that feels impossible, if someone has told you that you don't have enough, that you haven't contributed enough, that you should just accept what you're given, is that the version of yourself who knew better before you were told otherwise is still in there? Sloane the investigator didn't disappear when Sloane the wife took over. She waited. She stayed sharp in small ways, through small choices, and when she was needed, she was ready. Resilience isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's the license you keep renewing. The folder you don't throw away. The phone call you make at 7 in the morning when you're still in shock, but you make it anyway. It's the accumulation of small acts of refusing to fully give up on yourself, even when you're not sure why you're bothering. My grandmother was right. The people who underestimate you are doing you a favor. Let them.